This is Science Friday. I'm Arielle Duhaime-Ross. Take a quick moment to think about your surroundings. Tune into your senses and contemplate what's happening around you. What do you see, hear, smell? Now, I want you to imagine, what if you were a bat? How would you experience the space around you differently? Maybe you could sense a spider through echolocation, or feel minute changes in air pressure and temperature to know where to fly to next. Back with us again to talk about how senses, both familiar and foreign to us, help animals experience their environment, and to tell us what he's learned in the past year since his book was published, is my guest. Ed Yong is a science writer and the author of An Immense World: How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us, out now in paperback, and January's read for the SciFri Book Club. Ed, welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here again. So in each chapter of An Immense World, you focus on a certain sensory system, like sight, smell, pain. You've gotten a lot of feedback, I would imagine, on your book since it was published. Is there a particular chapter that has resonated with readers and maybe changed how they understand non-human animals?
Ooh, so I think that the very first chapter on smell always particularly strikes a chord with people, and it was intended that way, right? We wanted to come out of the gate strong, and I think smell is very poignant for a few reasons. Firstly, it starts with dogs, and for people who have dogs, like the two of us, it really changes the way you think about this creature that you spend most of your time with. And we really wanted that. We wanted to take something that, by we I mean myself, my editor Hilary. We really wanted to take something that was very familiar and everyday, and imbue it with this new sense of almost magical reality. I think smell is also a sense that is familiar to many of us, but we don't use it in the same way that other animals do. We use it in a more limited way. For us, smell is really about identification. It's here's
Right.
a glass of wine. What do you detect in it? Whereas for other creatures, smell is so much more. For ants and elephants, smell is the centerpiece of their social lives. For birds like albatrosses, smell is a way of finding food in a landscape, the open ocean that seems otherwise featureless. So smell is about navigation, it's about communication, and I think the chapter gets all of that across. It does sort of all the things I really want from the book. It shows some really fascinating animals, some everyday animals in a new light, and it shows you this sense that we kind of think we understand, but facets and sides to it that are extraordinary and that we don't really think about.
Yeah, I listen, you know this, but the examples of the dog were so poignant, and the
Mhm.
visual of you bending down and smelling the ground that had, also doing the same exercise that the dog had just done was so powerful and really interesting. So I really appreciate you for including all of that in there.
Right, yeah. I think that the bit about dogs, for people who haven't read the book, talks about how important smell is to dogs. It talks about like the hardware, the stuff inside their nose that gives them this very different and continuous perception of the olfactory world, whereas ours kind of flickers in and out as we inhale and exhale. It also just talks about how much dogs use their nose. If you watch two dogs greet each other, they'll sniff each other first. If you watch dogs go for a walk, what they'll want to do is to sniff, to explore, to spend huge amounts of time, absurd amounts of time investigating little patches of pavement or plants that seem nondescript to us. And it's about how dog owners often deny them that enjoyment, that access to the world, because we see walks as a form of exercise or a form of travel from A to B. And I think their lives are enriched when we take into account what their sensory worlds are like, and act accordingly to allow them the chance to sniff. I think that hits home because a lot of the book talks about how we by not thinking about how other animals sense the world, we misunderstand them, sometimes with harmful results. And this is a clear example of that. And it's a case where the creature we're harming is, for most of us, one that we love and actually want the very best for. And I think it gets some of the stakes of this topic across in a powerful way right off the gate. Originally, the first draft I filed, vision was the start, because I figured vision, is the sense that, for those of us who can see, is primary, it's dominant. Start with the obvious stuff and then go into weirder territory. And Hillary's point was, which I think was absolutely right, is no, you want to start with something that's a little bit off usual. And also, if we start with smell, readers begin with dogs. If we start with vision, they begin with spiders, which is going to be a harder set, right? Like, you want them to be into the book before you hit them with endless reams of spider content, which we do, but it comes in a bit later.
Well, I love the spider content. So yeah, I still think that was a good choice. So a while back, I spent a lot of time thinking about the inner lives of animals, because I was working on a podcast that recounted experiments where humans attempted to teach gorillas and chimps to communicate through sign language. And that work had a really profound impact on how I view all animals and the ways in which they communicate. Now, your book is about the inner world of animals as well, but you tackle it through their senses and through their experiences of the world via their senses.
Yeah.
How did learning and writing about how animals process the world around them, how did that impact your own experience of the world?
Oh, I mean, enormously. There's sort of two goals for an immense world. One is to change our understanding of animals themselves, right? To show them cool sides to the creatures around us and expose new aspects of their lives. But the other is to change our understanding of the world around us, to make us see things that seem mundane in a magical way, or that seem ordinary in an extraordinary way. And I think that, for me, researching and writing the book absolutely did that. I can't look at basically anything around me in the natural world in the same way as before. So let's just take some examples. I can look out. I'm looking out my window. I can see the street in front of me. I can see trees lining it. I can see flowers that are blooming. I know those flowers have patterns on them that I can't see, because those colors are not intended for my eyes. They have ultraviolet bullseyes and halos and other signals that insects that can see ultraviolet can see. Those flowers also have electric fields around them, which bees and perhaps other insects can sense. And they can use to distinguish different species, or perhaps flowers that have recently been pollinated from those who can't, from those that weren't. I can see someone walking their dog. I know through walking my own dog that the pavements around me are just constantly changing. They're full of scent. They're full of smell, bursting with interesting information that I can't detect. I can see birds perched on the power lines going across the street. I know that those birds, so we have a mockingbird, some house finches. Those birds can hear qualities in their songs that I can't hear. So house finches have this very beautiful melodic song. It goes by very quickly. There's clearly elements to it that I can't make out, that I can't perceive. And indeed there are, right? The birds with their faster hearing can hear these qualities and actually pay attention to those minute changes in pitch and volume that are too fast for my ears to detect. So the mockingbird can absolutely detect those and mimic those qualities pretty well. Both of those birds can also see the same kinds of ultraviolet that the bees and other pollinators can see, but they also combine those with other colors into this extra dimension of color that I can't see and that the bees can't see either. So this very normal neighborhood scene that I look out on every day is just bursting with kind of fresh magic if I think about what other animals are experiencing. And I get that all the time now.
It's so lovely. I am really glad you brought up birds, because as someone who follows you on social media, I know that you know, you recently have taken up bird and wildlife photography. Obviously, you've always been an animal person, but did An Immense World play a role in getting you there to that photography aspect? And does it help? You know, does it help you with your wildlife
Mm.
photography to know these things about some of the creatures that you're taking pictures of?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that so I got into birding and photography through a route that wasn't directly related to the book, but was sort of tangentially related. I wrote An Immense World, most of it during the middle of the COVID pandemic, while reporting on this horrific event in which we were all embroiled. I wrote about how in the book, the pandemic, in the early pandemic, people talked about how they could hear more birds around them, because everyone was quieter, and that unmasks a lot of the noises that our normal levels of noise pollution occlude. And I was thinking a lot about this, of all the facts that nature is in our backyards. I've said that in many talks about the books, the topic of animal senses reveals that nature is all around us, that wilderness is all around us if we just care to look. I moved to California in May, and suddenly a lot of those themes were very, very apparent. I can hear birdsong to a degree that I really couldn't when I was living in the middle of downtown DC. I can walk out my door in the morning and identify maybe a dozen different birds in the neighborhood by sound. I can see many more just by looking quite carefully. And a lot of that just made me more interested in the nature that was around in all around us, literally in my backyard. I moved into this house, and on night one there was an Anna's hummingbird on this bare perch in the garden. And yeah, relatedly, reporting on COVID is very difficult, very punishing for my mental health, and that for many others. And birding was a salve for that, and being out in nature, immersing myself in it, realizing how much all wonder and beauty was around me all the time was very, very healing and very helpful. And I think all of these pieces came together at kind of the same time.
Well, I'm really glad that you found that. I think that's really lovely. Nancy has a question about the many, many people you interviewed to make this book possible. Go ahead, Nancy. Welcome to Science Friday.
Hello from New York, where it's cold and not at all like California right now. I was very interested in the scientists that you worked with, and I was wondering if there were any similar categories or characteristics of them that you could identify. They seemed pretty isolated to me and driven by things that I never would have thought necessary or important, and I was very happy to read about them.
Certainly not isolated. It is in the nature of a book like this where we introduce people, one at a time, and I can see why you might think that. The other piece of it, driven, yes, very much so, and I think also very thoughtful and just generally like delightful to talk to. I have reported on a wide variety of scientific disciplines over my career. And I can tell you that some of them have people who are more pleasant to be around than others. This was certainly one of them. I've wondered about why that is. And I think there's a few reasons. You've said, Nancy, quite rightly, that a lot of these people care about things that I wouldn't say that most people don't care about, but certainly like, they care about animals for their own sake. Maybe in their grants, they put something about the applications for humanity and so on, but they're in it for the curiosity, and they're in it because they care about the creatures. And I think that line of curiosity-driven research, especially driven by curiosity about the natural world, it attracts a certain kind of person. It attracts people who have that kind of joyous, almost childlike quality to the way they look at the world. And I think that you know, An Immense World is a book that at its core is about empathy. And I think that this entire field is at its core about empathy. It's about trying to put yourself inside the perspectives of creatures that are very different to you and think about what their lives are like. I think if it's hard to succeed without doing that. And, you know, maybe that side of it is not in the scientific literature, that's one of the fields, but I guarantee you that every person I've interviewed, almost everyone, has thought about these questions. You know, what is it like to be an electric fish? What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be an elephant? They have spent serious time thinking about it, and I think that attracts a certain type of person, like someone who's quite empathetic, someone who's interested in other perspectives. And you know, those qualities together, the sort of joyful curiosity and the empathy, I think explain why I certainly had so much fun talking to the scientists that I did for this book.
Staying on the topic of the scientists and the research for a minute, I've been itching to ask you about the chapter on magnetic. Let me say that again for the recording.
Right.
I've been itching to ask you about the chapter on magnetic fields, which fortunately you weren't asked about the last time that you came onto the show. I was really struck by the fact that this is the sense that scientists know the least about. Can you talk me through some of the difficulties tied to researching how animals sense our planet's magnetic field?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was probably the most recent sense to be discovered. It was in the sort of 50s or 60s when people realized that songbirds, even without any other kinds of landmarks, could head in the right direction when it came time to migrate. And we now know that many animals can do this. So songbirds absolutely can. Sea turtles can do it. A lot of creatures seem to have this magnetic sense. But magnetoreception, the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field, is the only sense for which we don't know the sense organ, the receptor, that's the cell that picks up the magnetic field, or really how any of that works. Now, it's not that we have no ideas, right? We just know it. We just know it happens. We know animals can do it, but the hows and what's and wherefores, most of that is still mysterious. There are some really strong hypotheses, and I'm pretty sure like one or more of these is going to be right. So it's not like we know nothing, but there are still big question marks. So anyone who tells you that we've solved the puzzle is lying. Now, the reason why it's really hard, there's a bunch of different reasons. So some of them have to do with with magnetic fields themselves, which are just a very different kind of stimulus than like light or sound or smells. Magnetic fields notably are not impeded or reduced by living matter. So they pass through flesh. They're not blocked by bone or by skin. So while for a lot of other senses, you need the sense organs to be on the surface of the body, and you need some kind of hole in a skeleton or an exoskeleton to house those organs, with magnetic fields, you don't. Like the sensor could be anywhere. So there's no obvious anatomical clue. There's no like pore or hole or opening that might let you think, hey, that's where a sense organ might be. You know, the magnetic sensor could be, you know, if I could sense magnetic fields, it could be my eyes, it could be in my toes, it could be maybe a distributed sensor that's literally in every cell of my body. Like all of these things are possible. Then there's the fact that because we do not sense magnetic fields, it is a really difficult stimulus to study in experiments, right? Like if I wanted to test the vision of an animal, I could show them different sights, different colors, different wavelengths of light, and see how they responded. It's a little harder to do that with magnetic fields, like to produce artificial magnetic fields. And crucially, it's really hard to then know if you've done it right. You know, if I do a vision experiment and suddenly, and like, I've messed up the equipment and like flashing lights are blaring all the time, or it's showing red instead of blue, I can see that, right? Like I know when I've screwed up. You don't know that with magnetic fields, right? So just doing the work is extremely hard. And then the stimulus is noisy, right? So magnetic fields are very, very weak, which means you're not going to be able to sense them with any kind of precision, even if you do. It's likely that you're probably, with that, whatever magnetic sensor exists, is like taking readings over time and getting a kind of average, right? But that means that how do you do an experiment on that, right? Like over what time frame is the averaging happening? So for stimuli that are very weak, very noisy, it's very hard. And then, the final reason is just that is actually about, I think, the nature of science, like how knowledge is constructed. Because this is so mysterious and because there's so much at stake here, it's the final frontier of sensory biology. It's the last great unknown sense. There's a huge amount of competition to try and find the magnetic sensing organ, the receptor, the mechanism, all of that. I mean, there's people talk about how there's a Nobel Prize at stake. I don't think that's true, but like there's certainly a lot of like glory and renown for whoever nails down the answers to all of these questions. And for that reason, I think a lot of people are doing honestly like sloppy work. That kind of pressure pushes people to to try and win rather than to find out the right answer. And because of that and the inherent difficulties in studying this sense, there's a lot of that's published about magnetic sensing that probably isn't true. There's a lot of retractions and failed replications in this field. And I think that's just sort of how a lot of science works sometimes.
Right. I'd imagine that you had to sift through a lot of that in order to actually write that chapter. But moving on just a little bit, Jeff from Illinois has a question about how climate change might change the way we perceive other animals. Jeff, welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, thanks for having me. Ed, awesome book. I also love your other book as well. Yeah, so I study climate change and I teach climate change in high school. And I was just, after reading your book, very eye-opening. I know you say that like everything we write about is eye perception, but have
Right.
you talked with scientists at all about how this climate change could be dramatically changing the landscape for a lot of the organisms on the planet? And if that's the case, is this a way, a vector for us as science teachers or science communicators to just kind of help the public know that the world that we're in is not perfect and it's not permanent and we need to treat it better?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've sort of been asked this before, and I actually don't have a good answer with it because I don't think it's the case that. Are there cases where climate change is changing the ways animals sense the world, or what that is for animals to sense? I'm not sure. I can think of like some very, very specific and niche examples. Like, for example, I mentioned these organisms called chitons. They look like a Cornish pasty that's stuck on a seaside rock. They're covered in armor plates, and they have these eyes that have lenses made of rock, literally mineral lenses made the same substances as a lot of shelled organisms in the sea. Because they're mineral, they're very susceptible to the effects of ocean acidification, for example. So in a world that gets warmer, where the oceans become more acid, you might actually get a world in which chitons can't see anymore. But I'm struggling to think of like other examples, right, where you're really changing the kind of information animals get about the world. And that's not to say that, of course, that climate change isn't a problem, but it's more that it is seriously affecting the lives of animals in a way that's like tangential to the thrust of the book. So at the end, I talk about ways in which humans are screwing things up for the sensory worlds of animals. But that is more through the production of light and noise pollution. So the sensory pollution, this extra stimulus that we're pumping into the world at times of quiet and times of darkness that are harming many of the creatures around us. There is, I guess, so there are some climate related angles in that, like some of the things we do that pump out a ton of sensory pollution are the same things that are accelerating the course of the changing climate. So vehicles are a huge source of noise pollution, for example, and actually the faster you go, the worse that problem becomes. A lot of LED lights that are actually more energy efficient are worse for light pollution because they're pumping out wavelengths that are specifically harmful to a lot of creatures. So there's kind of a trade-off there, or one we can mitigate, but one that we need to think about.
Ed, you've now announced a third book, and we'll talk about that in a second. But now that you have this other book on your to-do list, I don't know if you've started writing it yet. I would assume yes. Is there any lesson that you hope to take with you as you write the next one?
You mean from An Immense World?
Yeah, from either the process of writing it or the reception.
Yes, and that's a good question. So I'll talk about the next book because it only makes sense in that context. So
Sure.
the third book, which I'm currently in the process of researching, is called The Infinite Extent. And it is about life at different scales. It is about what it is like to be the size of a blue whale or the size of a bacterium, to live for millennia like a bristlecone pine, or for a few minutes like a mayfly, to live a very individual existence like a human, or something that complicates the concept of individuality, like an ant colony or a quaking aspen grove, or slime molds. So in many ways, this is a direct continuation of some of the ideas that I explored in I Contain Multitudes and An Immense World. And I do indeed think of these three books as a trilogy. I never really planned them as such, but I think once the idea for The Infinite Extent hit me, it became clear that this was a continuous series of work. And this is the kind of capstone. It's the same kinds of ideas about showing people sides to the natural world that they might not have considered, that are wondrous, that are magical, and just recalibrating our understanding of nature and its possibilities. In many ways, it is a more ambitious book than the previous two. The first two books had like specific fields, right? There was microbial ecology, sensory biology. This one is sort of about everything. It is frustratingly kind of about everything, because scale impacts basically every aspect of life. And so it's bigger. I'm glad that I had written the first two books first. I think if I'd tried to do this one first, it would not have worked. I think I just understand now better how to write a book. And for me, the biggest lesson is to be incredibly clear about what you are trying to do from the start. So I'm all about structure and I'm all about planning. So I'm maybe a month and a half into the research phase. I've got this year to roughly this year I'm researching and reporting on the book. Next year I'm writing it. I already have a pretty clear map of what all the chapters are and where they go relative, like which order they're going to be in. I am looking at every chapter and working out who are like the protagonists, what are the big themes, what are the big ideas. I have a planning document that includes sections like what this book is and what this book is not. Like what is the promise of the book to a reader? What is my bargain to someone who picks up The Infinite Extent? And what are the failure modes for the book? Like, if I imagine like the worst negative review of what this book could be, what is that? Like, how could I potentially stumble on this? Like, what are the obvious like pitfalls? And then, you know, obviously like trying to stay clear of them, right? So but there is just a huge amount of care and attention, even at this like quite conceptual stage. You know, at no point do I ever just write, and at no point do I ever just even like really report without having that that skeleton, without having that anatomy of the project, without having that like pretty intense level of baseline thought that goes into it. And that's something that I think has always been true to my work, but really like just became honed to a fine point in the creation of the first two books, in doing a lot of the pandemic reporting and so on. You know, I've often said that writing is not magic. Writing is not this, you know, this labored, passionate craft that obviously it is a work of work of love, but for me, writing is intentionality times practice.
Right.
It is knowing exactly what you are trying to do at every level, from sentence to chapter, and then doing it enough that it becomes second nature.
Yeah, writing is a practice, absolutely. What you just described reminds me a lot of Robert Caro's process that he writes about in his book on writing. So if anybody wants to hear more about, you know, a very intricate form of research and how to plan out a book, highly recommend that one. We're going to go to another listener. Steve from Turner Falls, Massachusetts, has a really delightful question about plants. Steve, welcome to Science Friday.
The question about plants was, is there an Umwelten for plants?
I'm going to do a plant question. That is a great question. Obviously, my book is about animals. I didn't talk about plants, but I think, yes, you know, it's going to be very, very different than what an Umwelt is like for an animal. Plants just have a radically different biology, but plants also sense and respond to the world around them. For people who read An Immense World and thought, but what about plants? I highly, highly recommend that you pre-order a book called The Light Eaters by Zoe Schlanger, who will answer all of your questions. It is a magnificent book that I had the pleasure of reading an early copy of, and I have written a blurb for it. I think it is fantastic, and I see it as like a sister book to mine. So if you read An Immense World and you thought, great, not enough plant content, The Light Eaters, Zoe Schlanger, coming to a bookstore near you.
I really hope that Zoe gets to hear this. Zoe is a friend of mine, and I really hope that she gets to hear what you just said, because that's beautiful. That's really lovely. Okay, moving on. So your book was published more than a year ago. Looking back now at the person that you were when you published it, how have you changed since then? You know, how has your perspective of the world and the animals we share it with changed?
Well, that is a great question. So, you know, when I started writing An Immense World, I did not have a dog, and in fact had never had a dog before. So now I do, and I think really having an animal in your life, sharing your home all the time, really does change your relationship to the natural world. It helped that I think I thought about all the stuff about smell that we've talked about before I had my dog, Typo, it helped me raise him in a very specific smell-oriented way. It helps me think about his world more. And obviously, as we've said, I am birding now. And, you know, I truly cannot overemphasize how much joy I have found through birding. You know, I've written about the natural world for my entire career. I've been fascinated by animals for as long as I can remember. And it's kind of weird to me and to everyone else who knows me in retrospect that I wasn't a birder before. It's made me think about the way we engage with nature. I have a voluminous academic understanding of the animal kingdom. I could, recite you fun animal facts and tell you interesting things about the animal world for a nigh infinite amount of time. But actually going out and birding gets me something very different. I understand the birds in my neighborhood. I understand their relationship to the seasons, to the times of day. I know when birds are more likely to be active. I know which species disappear in which seasons, which ones are most common in which parts of my county. I know how to find, rare species. I know which the rarities are. And I find myself paying attention to the weather a lot more, to the tides, to the passage of time over the day and over the year. And there's something very grounding about all of that. I think as science writers and science journalists, sometimes the knowledge we accumulate is like bereft of that context. It just sort of floats out in the ether. It's little stacks of trivia that sit in our head. And what I gain from birding is a way of rooting all of that in the land around me. And that is just invaluable. It's also kind of informs a lot of my approach to photography. There is a birder who I went on an outing with recently, Steve Hampton, gave me the loveliest compliment, which was that my bird photos are kind of halfway between the photos birders take and the photos photographers take. Like birders, when they photograph a bird, tend to just like want the photo that's like the field guide, right? It's like the bird is facing to the side, like all the field marks are very clear. And the photographers often want this like slightly abstracted version of the bird. It's like the bird is crisp in focus, the background is creamy and blurry, it's on a branch, but there's maybe nothing else there. And right, I feel like on the former robs the animal of some of its animacy, its life, it's the artistic side of nature, but the latter robs it of its context, its environment, its surroundings, and I'm trying to, I really want to try and capture both, because that sort of feels truer to how I think about nature and also how I think about my own experience with nature, that it did previously feel a lot more like decontextualized than it does now.
I really love the idea that writing this book and then getting a dog like Typo and getting into birding has sort of opened you up to being more present. More. It's a beautiful practice that you're talking about. It's really lovely to hear about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way of thinking about it. Just briefly, like I've just often described birding as being more meditative than actual meditation, and it does feel like that. There's something about being very present, using multiple senses, certainly sight and hearing, and just focusing in on small parts of nature, looking down into that bush, gazing into that, like into those branches, in a way that you normally don't. And yeah, it's the kind and the degree of presentism that it encourages is really wonderful.
We have time for one last question from our audience, and Thomas has a question about how we as humans might be able to be more sensitive to other animals' Umwelten. Go ahead, Thomas. Welcome to Science Friday.
Hi, thanks so much. So first of all, I just wanted to say, like, as a teacher, I think historically there's been this problem with talking about the environment where we just dump all of the Earth's woes onto students, and then we act surprised that, they kind of get cynical or disinterested about helping the earth. So I think your presentation of Umwelten is just so perfect for teaching students how to love nature first, and then that kind of want to be better just comes from within them, which is awesome. So in that spirit, and I know you mentioned some towards the end of the book, but they're more like policy oriented, but what are some practical steps that we as individuals can take to shape our spaces to be more sensitive to other animals, Umwelten?
That's a great question, Thomas. And, thank you as a teacher for all the work that you do. None of us could do without you. I think that I struggle with this a bit because I actually do really want to focus on the policy part of it, right? Like we don't actually get out of any of these big challenges by just, relying on individual people to turn off their equipment at night, or just do any of the things that we've often been sold as the solutions to climate change or sensory pollution or whatever. No, this is stuff that requires big policy changes, regulation, and so on, right? I sort of don't want to move away from that, because that actually is what we need to do. The individual piece of it can be important, but it does end up being a bit of a red herring, in a way that actors who really should be taking responsibility end up shifting responsibility onto people. For each of us individually, there's things we can do. If you're a dog owner, you can take your dogs on smell walks. If you, the kinds of things that are generally good for nature, like plant native gardens for pollinators, turn your lights up at night, that kind of thing. Be quiet when you go on a hike. For the birders among you, also do that, please. They're very, very helpful. But I think that core to all of that is what you actually described, Thomas. Telling people, getting people to love the natural world, it feels kind of hokey, but I think is actually the crucial first step, for exactly the reasons you described. You telling people what is at stake and what the problems are has no impact if they don't already care. And so an immense world is about getting people to care. It's about giving them a reason to care, and without beating them over the head with it and saying you should care. It's just saying here is the world. And I think that if you do that enough, the world is so beautiful and so immense and so wondrous that a lot of people can't help but to care than they already do.
Thank you for that. I know that this can be really challenging work, but can you explain to our audience why writing about the inner lives of animals can be so difficult?
Yeah, it's because you can never really know. This is the Thomas Nagel thing. What is it like to be a bat? He argued that you will never really know what it's like to be a bat. You can sort of imagine, but and no matter how much I learn about echolocation, I still don't fully understand what it is like to experience the world in the way that a bat does, or a dog does. I spend every day with my dog. I know him better than I know any other non-human animal, and yet I still don't really know what's going on inside his little head. And that's the challenge that I am trying to get people to step inside the heads of other creatures. I want them to try and understand the world, to experience the world as a mantis shrimp or a bee or a hummingbird might. And I know that they can't. Right? They can try, they can get some of the way there, but they will never get all the way there. And there's something inherently difficult about foisting an unsolvable challenge onto the reader and onto myself. But my argument is that it's worth the effort for all the reasons that we described, right? There's glory in the striving and the attempt.
Yeah. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you again for taking the time to come back to speak with us, Ed. We all really appreciate it.
Thanks, Arielle. Good to see you. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Take care.
Ed Yong is a science writer and the author of An Immense World, How Animal Senses Revealed Hidden Realms Around Us, which is our January book choice for the SciFri Book Club. And if you want to learn more about the SciFri Book Club and read along with us, you can find out more at sciencefriday.com/book club. Happy reading.